Hey guys, this is Mike Mahaffey, the old bastard BJJ guy, here for BJJ Mental Models. Back in my day, we had to walk uphill in the snow both ways to get to the academy just to learn some crappy technique from a random purple belt. You kids have it so easy because now you can just subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium and get tons of great audio courses to learn new techniques, enhance your mindset, and entertain yourself. You can even get personalized rolling reviews from some of your favorite BJJ Mental Models coaches, including me. It's like having your own seminar, you spoiled little whippersnappers. So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to BJJ Mental Models Premium right now, get off my lawn, and go train.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach, and in this week's mini episode, we continue our conversation about the different types of choking mechanics in jiu-jitsu. This time we're talking about cranks. Now, before we go any further, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, wait a minute, Steve. Cranks, those aren't a choke. That's a different type of attack. You're attacking the spine, not the blood supply or the air supply. You're deceiving me, Steve. You're lying to me. I knew I should have listened to my parents and never trust a Canadian. Well, this one time, I think you can listen to me. You're absolutely right. Cranks are technically not a type of choke. A crank is an attack on the spinal cord, and the way that you attack the spinal cord is usually by attacking the neck. You're not likely to get a good enough handle on the torso to attack the spine from there, so in jiu-jitsu, when we're attacking the spine, it usually comes from attacking the neck. And there's a few different ways to do this. You can either pull the head forward like a can opener. You can either pop the head backward like a Pez dispenser. There's a pro wrestling submission you could do here called a dragon sleeper. It's nasty. You can also twist the neck side to side. That's how a twister works. Presumably, and I've never tried it, you could also pull the head just straight up like those crazy chiropractors on YouTube. I don't know of any submissions that do that, but I guess it would work. And also you can just do kind of like a slicer mechanic against the neck, where you use your forearm into the neck and the pressure against the spine is enough to get the tap. If you want an example of that, think of the arm triangle. Sometimes when you finish an arm triangle, it's partially a crank, and that might be because your arm is just digging into the back of their neck, and when you squeeze, the pressure on their neck is enough to help you get the tap. Either way though, all of these mechanics are all about damaging the spine. Ultimately, what you're trying to do with a crank is threaten your opponent enough with damage to the spine that they have to submit. Now, as you can imagine, cranks are dangerous. There is a reason why under many rule sets they are not legal. You could even make an argument that for the rule sets where they are legal, maybe that should be reconsidered. I personally am not a fan of cranks, just from a safety standpoint. We always need to think with any submission we do, what is the risk of long-term injury to our opponents? With arm bars, with knee bars, there's always going to be some degree of risk, but you damage someone's neck, and that's the type of injury that you don't come back from. So, although cranks are legal under some rule sets, I always suggest that people think very long and hard about how they implement these into their game. It's the type of injury that you don't want to inflict on someone else, you don't want to have it inflicted onto you, and it's very hard to recover from them. The reason I'm including cranks in this discussion of the different types of chokes is because although a crank is technically not a choke, you're not cutting off blood or oxygen, it's still a type of submission that you're going to execute by doing the same types of things that you would do to complete a choke. So for example, if you are attacking the neck, if you're going for a blood or an air choke, the way that you would control someone's head is similar to the way that you would complete a crank. Also, much of the time when you try to submit someone with a choke, it may have an element of a crank included. And although we often encourage people to focus on trying to complete our chokes by cutting off blood flow or oxygen, sometimes it's just really hard to avoid a bit of a crank. This I find happens a lot with head and arm chokes. Some types of chokes like the Peruvian necktie, it's very hard to do those without an element of a crank involved. So there's an argument to be made that we shouldn't worry too much about whether there's a bit of a crank when we're going for a choke. If someone tells you that your choke wasn't clean because there was an aspect of a crank, you could argue that they're right, and you could argue that in competition, you're more likely to get the submission if you do a quote-unquote clean choke. That said though, I don't know of any competitor who does not take neck cranks very seriously. People might tough their way through an arm bar, they might tough their way through a knee bar, but I don't know many people who would be dumb enough to try to tough their way through a neck crank. At least not at the professional level. But that's where neck cranks become dangerous, because at the hobbyist level, sometimes we do really dumb things. Sometimes we neck crank our friends, and they have too much of an ego to tap. And we can talk all day long about the ethics of the tap and whose fault it is if you don't tap to a submission. But really, regardless of whose fault it is, you do not want to be the person with that on your conscience if you break someone's neck because you put them in a submission in the gym. So with cranks, be very careful. I suggest to people, if you want to do dedicated cranks like twisters or can openers, first of all, make sure that there is consent involved. If your training partner is coming into the gym under the impression that they are doing an IBJJF gi roll and you just throw them into a twister, that says something about you. Don't do that. Cranks are one of those techniques that you only want to do if there is informed consent from all parties involved. Now, that said, in competition, study the rules. People often neglect cranks. They don't really think about them as something that's likely to happen, but you may find yourself in a competition where you get put into a crank, and if you don't know whether it's legal or not, that's a big problem. One situation you want to avoid is where you're caught in a crank in a competition, you don't know whether it's legal or not, and you're waiting while you're in the submission for the ref to make a call, and you don't know what's going to happen. Don't be in that situation. Make sure you always understand the legality of cranks, and if you're going to use them in the gym, be very explicit with your training partner about whether those are okay for the role that you have with them. This is especially important because if the person has prior neck injuries, doing a crank is just a really terrible thing to do, so be very, very careful. Now, with that said, how does a crank work? Like with most other submissions, we are either trying to take the joint, in this case the neck, outside of its regular range of motion, or in the case of a slicer type crank, you're trying to put enough bone-on-bone pressure on their neck that they're going to have to tap out. The example, once again, that I'll bring up is pretend that you are in bottom side control and your opponent has you in an arm triangle. Sometimes the way that they squeeze might not just be putting pressure on your carotid arteries, it also might be putting pressure on the back of the neck. Remember in the blood choke episode a few back, we talked about how when you do a blood choke, you want to have pressure on all three sides of the triangle, one carotid, the other carotid, and the back of the neck. When you're doing an arm triangle, sometimes the pressure on the back of the neck, just because you're against the floor, gravity is on your side, and you've got your forearm digging into the back of their neck, it can create a crank, like a slicer, that might make the submission more brutal than it was intended to be. So with all of this said, why do we care about cranks? If they're nasty and if they're not legal under a lot of rule sets, can we just ignore them? The answer is no. And the reason why is because if the submission looks like a choke, the ref will treat it like a choke. Sometimes you're stuck in a move and you can feel that it's a crank, but the ref can't feel that. They might think it's a choke, and if you tap, they're going to treat that as a choke. So cranks are going to happen, and even if they're technically illegal, they do happen as a side effect of chokes. That's why I like to include them in the family of chokes, because although they are not actually a choke, they attack the same body part as a choke, they tend to occur in similar situations to a choke, they often are a byproduct of a choke, and they may look enough like a choke that a ref may treat them as one. So because of all of this, we often want to include them in this family. We'll talk more about breaking mechanics later on when it comes to how you deal with arms and legs, but we're not going to include neck submissions in there because when you're attacking the arms and legs, you don't switch from an arm bar to a crank. You don't switch from a knee bar to a crank. When you are doing a crank, it is normally a deliberate attempt to attack the head. So with all of that said, there's a quick primer on cranks. They probably don't merit as much technical explanation as a lot of the other submissions because the neck doesn't have the same type of mobility that your arms or legs do. For a lot of cranks, you want to immobilize the person and then put pressure on the neck. So far, we've talked about blood chokes, air chokes, compression chokes, and cranks. In the next and final mini episode on choking mechanics, we're going to talk about hybrid chokes. That's where you combine more than one of these methods into a choke so that there's many different mechanisms that you're using to choke a person at the same time. If you want to listen to the other mini episodes about chokes, or if you want to check out everything else that we make at BJJ Mental Models, just go to bjjmentalmodels.com. That's where you can find all episodes of our podcast. You can sign up to our newsletter. You can join Premium. If you're not already a premium subscriber, I really suggest that you become one. We just launched a new podcast called BJJ Today. It's hosted by Andrea Tang. She is a journalist best known for her work at the Jiu-Jitsu Times, and in the first episode, she interviews Adele Fornerino and her coach Jake O'Driscoll on their tremendous success at ADCC this year. It's going to be a fantastic show. We've also got many other shows on the BJJ Mental Models Podcast Network. You only get all of that as a premium subscriber, plus all of our courses. We can also do coaching and rolling reviews. If you haven't already done so, I suggest that you just drop everything, sign up for a free trial now, and at least just check it out. There's no obligation to stay around. But if, like many other people, you do stay around, you might find that it's just the missing piece of the puzzle that you were looking to take your jiu-jitsu game and lifestyle to the next level. This is Steve signing off. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.